The morning air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, even though the fire had been extinguished days ago. Pastor David Grant stood on the cracked pavement, his dark eyes fixed on the charred remains of the community center on Elm Street. The once vibrant building was now a blackened skeleton, its walls reduced to soot-streaked rubble. Ash drifted lazily on the breeze, settling into the jagged cracks of the street like silent accusations. David sighed, his breath visible in the chilly November air. He adjusted the lapels of his worn-out coat, a hand-me-down from his father. For decades, the community center had been the heart of Oak Hill, a space where children laughed, parents gathered, and neighbors shared meals and stories. It was one of the few places where racial and economic divides softened, even if just for a moment. Now, it was gone, and with it, the fragile sense of unity that had once tied the neighborhood together. Across the street, Principal Sarah Whitaker leaned against her car, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched as David stepped closer to the ruins. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts, not just from the cold, but from the weight of the scene before her. The school she ran, Oak Hill Middle, was just a few blocks away, and she'd spent years trying to instill the same spirit of community the center had once fostered. Sarah pushed a strand of blonde hair from her face and walked toward David, her boots crunching over debris. "It feels different standing here, doesn't it?" she said softly, her voice carrying over the stillness. David turned, his expression unreadable. He recognized her immediately, Sarah Whitaker, the principal who was always in the local paper for her initiatives at the school. He nodded curtly. "Different doesn't begin to cover it." She hesitated, unsure if she was welcome in his grief. "I used to bring my son here. He loved the library upstairs, the books about space especially." David's gaze softened. "I remember him. Sam, right? Quiet kid, always building model rockets?" A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Yeah, this place meant a lot to us. And to so many others," David replied. His tone was gentle, but there was an edge of weariness. "It's more than a building. It was a refuge, a place where we could be more than the things that divide us." Sarah shifted awkwardly, unsure how to respond. She wanted to say something comforting, something profound, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she stared at the remnants of the center, the guilt gnawing at her. She had known about the growing tensions in the neighborhood, the festering resentment between the black and white communities, but she hadn't done enough to address it. "I'm sorry this happened," she said finally. David's jaw tightened. Sorry doesn't rebuild walls or bring back what's been lost. He exhaled sharply, realizing his words came out harsher than intended. "But thank you." They stood in silence for a moment, two figures caught in the gravity of a shared loss. Behind them, the faint sound of children's laughter carried on the wind. It came from the playground a block away, where a group of kids, black, white, and Hispanic, were chasing each other across the swings and slides. For a fleeting moment, it was as if nothing had changed, as if the community center still stood, and the neighborhood's wounds were healed. But the illusion shattered when a voice rang out sharply, "Stay on your side of the park." The words came from an older man sitting on a nearby bench, glaring at the group of children. He wore a grimace of disdain, and the kids hesitated, their game faltering under the weight of his command. The racial tension that simmered beneath the surface of Oak Hill boiled up again, even in the laughter of children. David clenched his fists, his heart sinking. "That's what we're up against," he muttered. Sarah's face flushed with anger and shame. "It doesn't have to be this way," she said, almost to herself. David turned to her, his expression firm. "No, it doesn't. But words alone won't fix it." She met his gaze, something igniting in her chest. "Then let's do more than talk." David raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you have in mind?" Sarah hesitated, but only for a moment. "We rebuild it. Together. The community center, the programs, the hope. It all comes back. Stronger this time." Her words hung in the air, a challenge and a plea wrapped in one. David studied her face, searching for any sign of insincerity. Instead, he saw determination, a kind of stubbornness that mirrored his own. "You really think that'll fix things?" he asked cautiously. "No," she admitted, "but it's a start." David glanced back at the ruins of the center, the ashes whispering the stories of what had been. Slowly, he nodded. "A start. I can work with that." For the first time that morning, the clouds seemed to lift. A plan hadn't formed yet, but a spark had been lit. Together, David and Sarah stood amidst the ashes, unaware of the challenges ahead, but resolute in their shared mission, to rebuild not just a building, but a community fractured by decades of division. Above them, the faint outline of a bridge on Elm Street stretched across the horizon, a symbol of what could be if they dared to believe in it. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows over Oak Hill, illuminating the cracks in the sidewalks and the peeling paint on storefronts. Pastor David Grant sat in the small office of his church, his fingers tracing the edges of a faded photograph on his desk. It was a picture of his father, Reverend Joseph Grant, standing arm in arm with a diverse group of activists during the civil rights movement. Their smiles were weary but defiant, their eyes full of hope for a future that still seemed painfully out of reach. David's phone buzzed, pulling him back to the present. It was another text from a congregant expressing doubts about the community center project. "Why work with them?" the message read. David sighed and set the phone aside. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the photo again. Why indeed? Across town, Sarah Whitaker was poring over old attendance records in her office at Oak Hill Middle School. Her desk was cluttered with papers and half-empty coffee cups, a testament to the hours she spent trying to address the endless challenges facing her students. Her son Sam's framed photo sat beside her computer, a younger version of him, holding a model rocket with a grin so wide it could brighten any room. She stopped typing and stared at the picture. Sam was in college now, far from the tensions of Oak Hill. He didn't have to see the fights that broke out in the cafeteria, or hear the coded language of parents who didn't want their kids sitting next to those children. But Sarah saw it every day, and each time it chipped away at her belief that she could make a difference. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Turner, one of the veteran teachers. "Principal Whitaker, do you have a moment?" Sarah gestured to a chair. "Of course, come in." Mrs. Turner hesitated before sitting down. "I heard about your meeting with Pastor Grant," she began. "People are talking." Sarah folded her hands. "Let me guess. Some are for it, some are against it, and most are skeptical." Mrs. Turner gave a small, humorless laugh. "That sounds about right, but I wanted to say, I think you're doing the right thing. This community needs something to believe in again." "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice soft. "I just hope we can actually pull it off." Mrs. Turner leaned forward. "You will, but you'll have to fight for it." That evening, David walked the familiar path to the house he'd grown up in, now his own. The porch swing creaked as he lowered himself onto it, the wood worn smooth by decades of use. The memories here were strong, some sweet, others bitter. His father had sat here many nights, telling him stories of marches, boycotts, and the unyielding hope that kept their family going through the darkest times. As a boy, David had idolized his father, but their relationship hadn't always been easy. Reverend Joseph Grant had been a man of conviction, sometimes to a fault. He believed in the power of unity, often preaching that bridges are stronger than walls. Yet he'd also faced betrayal, rejection, and violence from those unwilling to cross those bridges. David stared out at the empty street. He could hear his father's voice in his mind, urging him to keep building, to keep hoping. But the scars of his own experiences were fresh. The morning buzz at Oak Hill's town hall was a mix of skepticism, cautious optimism, and old grudges simmering just beneath the surface. Community members filled the folding chairs in the multi-purpose room, their conversations punctuated by the occasional sharp laugh or muttered disagreement. Pastor David Grant sat at the front of the room, his Bible resting on the table beside a stack of papers. Next to him, Principal Sarah Whitaker was going over her notes for what felt like the 100th time. The two had spent weeks planning this meeting, reaching out to leaders from both the black and white communities as well as the growing Hispanic population. Sarah leaned toward David, her voice low. "How many people do you think actually came to support this?" David glanced at the crowd, his sharp gaze picking up on crossed arms and suspicious stares. "Enough to start a conversation," he replied, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. The clock struck 10, and David stood, his tall frame commanding attention. The room quieted as he cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he began. His deep voice carried the weight of both authority and vulnerability. "We're here today because we've lost something important, the community center on Elm Street. For decades, it was a place where our children played, where our neighbors gathered, and where hope found a home. But now, it's gone. And if we don't act, the unity it represented will be gone too." There were murmurs of agreement, but also a few scoffs. Sarah rose, her hands clasped in front of her. "Pastor Grant and I believe that rebuilding the center isn't just about replacing a building. It's about addressing the divisions in our neighborhood. It's about creating a space where every family feels they belong." Her words hung in the air, but the silence was heavy. Finally, an older man in the back stood up. Mr. Jenkins, a longtime resident and vocal critic of anything involving change, pointed a finger at Sarah. "With all due respect, Principal Whitaker," he said, his voice rough with age, "why should we trust this will be any different? You rebuild it, sure, but what's to stop it from burning down again? You think a shiny new building's gonna fix decades of bad blood?" David stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. "Mr. Jenkins, I understand your concern. Trust me, I do. But this isn't just about bricks and mortar. This is about building programs that uplift our children, creating jobs for our neighbors, and fostering conversations that bring us together instead of tearing us apart." Before Jenkins could respond, a young Hispanic woman named Maria stood. She clutched her toddler's hand tightly, her voice trembling but resolute. "My son used to go to the after-school program at the center," she said. "When it closed, he started spending more time on the streets. I don't want him growing up thinking that's all he has. I don't care who's in charge, I just want a safe place for him." Her words cut through the tension, drawing nods from others in the room. Sarah seized the moment. "That's exactly what this is about. Safety, opportunity, community. We're not here to erase the past, but to learn from it and build something better." The meeting continued with questions and concerns flying from all corners of the room. Some voiced logistical doubts. Where would the funding come from? How would the center be maintained? Others let their frustrations spill out, grievances rooted in decades of mistrust and misunderstanding. As the hours dragged on, David and Sarah found themselves alternating between explaining their vision and deflecting criticism. By the time the meeting ended, their energy was nearly spent. But as the room began to clear, a middle-aged black woman named Mrs. Robinson approached them. She was a respected figure in the community, known for her sharp tongue and even sharper sense of justice. "Pastor Grant," she said, crossing her arms, "I've seen plenty of people make promises they couldn't keep. What makes this any different?" David held her gaze, his voice steady. "Because we're not just asking for trust, Mrs. Robinson. We're asking for help. This project won't succeed unless everyone has a hand in it." Mrs. Robinson studied him for a moment, then turned to Sarah. "You're going to have to work twice as hard to convince folks like me. But if you're serious about this, I'm willing to see where it goes." Sarah exhaled, relief washing over her. Thank you. That means more than you know. As Mrs. Robinson left, David looked at Sarah, a small smile breaking through his exhaustion. Well, that wasn't the disaster I expected. Sarah laughed softly. High praise coming from you. That night, back at his church, David sat in the sanctuary, the silence wrapping around him like a blanket. He stared at the stained glass window above the altar, the colorful shards forming a depiction of a bridge spanning a river. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Bridges are stronger than walls, son, but they take time and faith to build. Meanwhile, in her small apartment, Sarah sifted through her notes, jotting down ideas for fundraising events and outreach programs. Her son's picture caught her eye again, and she traced the edge of the frame with her finger. "We're going to do this, Sam," she whispered, as if he could hear her across the miles. "We have to." Though exhausted and uncertain, both David and Sarah felt a flicker of hope, a fragile but persistent flame. The proposal was just the beginning, and the road ahead would be long. But for the first time in years, it felt as though Oak Hill might be ready to start healing. The early morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of David's church, casting soft hues of blue and gold across the small congregation gathered in the pews. Pastor David Grant stood at the pulpit, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "I know the road ahead looks steep," he began, pausing to meet the eyes of those sitting before him. "But I also know this. Together, we can rebuild something that will outlast all of us. Not just a building, but a community, a place where every child, every family, feels they belong." There were murmurs of agreement, but doubt lingered in the furrowed brows and skeptical glances exchanged among the congregation. After the service, David mingled with his church members, hoping to rally volunteers for the first cleanup effort at the burned-down center. Some offered their help immediately, while others made excuses, their hesitations stemming from old wounds or the sheer weight of rebuilding something so broken. "I'll come by after work, Pastor," said a middle-aged man with calloused hands, avoiding David's gaze, "but I can't promise much." David nodded, his smile kind but knowing. Even an hour makes a difference. At Oak Hill Middle School, Sarah Whitaker stood in the cafeteria, clipboard in hand. Around her, a handful of students from the school council huddled, whispering nervously. "So let me get this straight," said Marcus, an outspoken 8th grader with a knack for finding flaws in every plan. "You want us to clean up trash and stuff? Like at the old center?" "Yes," Sarah said, her tone unwavering. "But it's more than that. This is a chance for you to take pride in your community, to be part of something bigger than yourselves." "Sounds boring," Marcus muttered, but another student, a shy girl named Elena, spoke up. "My brother used to play basketball there. He said it was like the only place he didn't feel different." Her voice faltered, but her words carried weight. Sarah placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. "Exactly. That's why this matters." Slowly, hands began to raise, and Sarah felt a flicker of hope. The following Saturday, the cleanup began. David arrived early, hauling brooms, shovels, and trash bags from his car. He was joined by a small but determined group: church members, students, parents, and a few hesitant residents who hovered near the edges of the lot, unsure whether to dive in or stay detached. Sarah showed up a few minutes later, dressed in jeans and an old sweatshirt, a tray of coffee cups balanced in her arms. "Fuel for the workers," she said with a smile, handing a cup to David. "Thanks," he said, sipping the coffee. "Didn't think I'd see this many people." "Neither did I," Sarah admitted, glancing at the group. "It's a start, though." The work was slow and messy. Volunteers cleared charred debris, pulled weeds that had grown unchecked, and scrubbed soot off the few remaining walls. At first, the atmosphere was tense, with little conversation beyond the occasional instruction. But as the hours passed, barriers began to fall. Maria, the young mother who had spoken at the town hall, arrived with her teenage son, Luis. Luis was reluctant, his earbuds firmly in place, but Maria was resolute. "You're helping," she told him, handing him a pair of gloves. Luis rolled his eyes but started working alongside a group of students from Sarah's school. Before long, he was laughing with Marcus, who had a knack for turning even the dullest tasks into jokes. Nearby, Mrs. Robinson, the skeptical community leader, worked beside a retired carpenter named Ed Harris. Ed had spent years on the fringes of the neighborhood, his openly racist views isolating him from both sides. But now, with a hammer in hand and a determination to redeem himself, he found himself nodding respectfully as Mrs. Robinson shared stories of her grandchildren. "Never thought I'd be doing this," Ed said gruffly, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. "Neither did I," Mrs. Robinson replied, her voice sharp but not unkind. "But it's about time." As the sun climbed higher, the sounds of laughter and conversation began to fill the air. At one point, Sarah stood back, watching the scene unfold. Children played on the swings that had survived the fire, their giggles mingling with the hum of activity. Adults who hadn't spoken in years worked side by side, their differences momentarily set aside. David joined her, leaning on a shovel. "Feels like a miracle, doesn't it?" "It does," Sarah said, her voice soft. "But it's not enough." David nodded. "You're right. This is just the beginning." By late afternoon, the lot looked transformed. The debris was cleared, the remaining walls cleaned, and the outlines of hope began to take shape. As the volunteers gathered to rest, Maria stood up, holding Luis's hand. "I just want to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling, "for giving us a reason to believe in this again." Her words drew applause, and for the first time in years, it felt as though Oak Hill might be capable of more than division. By 6:00 that evening, David sat in his study, jotting down names and notes from the day. A knock at the door interrupted him, and he opened it to find Sarah standing there, holding a folder. "I've been working on grant applications," she said, handing it to him. "We'll need more than volunteer efforts to get this done." David flipped through the pages, impressed. "You've been busy." "So have you," Sarah said with a smile. "Today was incredible." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It was, but now we have to keep the momentum going." Sarah hesitated. "Do you think we can?" David met her gaze. "If we don't give up, yes. One step at a time." As Sarah left, David returned to his desk, the flicker of hope in his heart growing into something steadier. The pieces were starting to come together, but the road ahead remained uncertain. Still, for the first time in years, it felt like they were walking it together. The sun was just beginning to rise over Oak Hill when Pastor David Grant parked his truck at the site of the former community center. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn, and the faint sounds of birdsong broke the morning stillness. He stepped out and walked toward the cleaned-up lot, which now bore faint chalk outlines marking where the walls of the new center would stand. In the middle of the space, a blank wooden wall had been erected, a temporary structure meant to hold architectural plans, but David saw potential for something more. He ran his hand over the smooth surface, an idea forming in his mind. By mid-morning, volunteers began arriving, and Sarah Whitaker was among the first. She carried a thermos of coffee and a determined expression, her usual armor against the chaos of the day. "Morning," she called out, waving to David as she approached. "Morning," he replied, gesturing to the wall. "I've got a new idea for this." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Something tells me it's more than a bulletin board." David smiled. "Much more. A wall of hope." Curious, Sarah set down her coffee and crossed her arms. Go on. We'll invite everyone in the community to write something on it, David explained. A memory of the old center, a message of encouragement, or a vision for what they hope this place will become. It'll remind people what we're working toward, and who we're working for. Sarah tilted her head, considering the idea. I like it. It's simple, but it could mean a lot to people. And, David added, it's something everyone can contribute to, no matter who they are or where they stand. Sarah nodded. Let's do it. By noon, the word had spread, and people began trickling in. At first, they came hesitantly, unsure of what to say or how to participate. But soon, the wall began to fill with words and drawings that carried the weight of both grief and hope. A young boy with messy curls drew a basketball hoop, accompanied by the words, "For all the games we used to play." His father stood behind him, his eyes glistening as he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Maria, the young mother who had become one of the project's most vocal supporters, added her own message. For my son, Luis, and every child who needs a safe place to dream. Even the skeptical Mrs. Robinson wrote a brief but heartfelt note. We rise when we lift each other. The most unexpected addition came from Ed Harris, the retired carpenter who had once been known for his divisive views. He stood silently at the wall for a long time, clutching a marker as if it weighed 100 pounds. Finally, he wrote, I was wrong. It's never too late to build something better. David watched from a distance, his heart heavy with both gratitude and sorrow. He knew the community's wounds ran deep, but moments like this gave him hope that they could heal. Later in the day, Sarah's students arrived, bringing bursts of energy and chatter. Marcus, the outspoken 8th grader, wrote, For the future. Elena, the quiet girl who rarely spoke in class, added a simple message that made Sarah's throat tighten. For everyone who feels invisible. David and Sarah worked alongside the volunteers, sharing laughter and stories as the wall became a living testament to the community's resilience. By the time the sun began to set, the wall was nearly full. Vibrant colors and heartfelt messages covered every inch, creating a patchwork of memories, dreams, and determination. That evening, as the last of the volunteers trickled away, David and Sarah stood before the wall, taking it all in. This, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion, this is what it's all about. David nodded. It's a start, but we still have a long way to go. Sarah glanced at him, a small smile playing on her lips. You always say that. Because it's true, David replied with a chuckle. Then his tone softened. But today, we took a step forward. The Wall of Hope became more than just a physical structure. It became a rallying point for the community. Over the following weeks, people from every corner of Oak Hill came to add their messages, transforming the wall into a mosaic of voices united by a shared vision. But not everyone was supportive. Vandals defaced a portion of the wall one night, spray painting hateful messages over the heartfelt notes and drawings. When David arrived the next morning and saw the damage, his heart sank. He called Sarah, who arrived shortly after, her face pale with anger. We can't let this stop us, Sarah said firmly. David nodded, his resolve hardening. No, we can't. Together they organized a community event to repaint the wall. Volunteers showed up in droves, and by the end of the day, the hateful graffiti was gone, replaced by even more messages of love and determination. The Wall of Hope became a symbol for Oak Hill, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, the community could come together to create something beautiful. For David and Sarah, it was a turning point. The challenges ahead still loomed large, but they knew now that they weren't facing them alone. The wall stood tall, not just as a structure, but as a promise. a promise that Oak Hill was more than its divisions, more than its pain. It was a community capable of hope, healing, and transformation, and it wasn't done yet. The crisp air of early winter settled over Oak Hill, but tensions in the neighborhood remained far from cool. Pastor David Grant could feel it in every strained conversation, every hesitant handshake. The Wall of Hope was now a beacon, a monument to possibility, but not everyone saw it that way. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered. For some, the project represented progress. For others, it stirred feelings of exclusion and fear of change. David stood in his church office, staring at a flyer left on his desk that morning. It was crude, a scrawled message over a blurry photo of the wall. "No new center. Stay in your place." He crumpled the flyer in his hand, anger surging. He'd spent years fighting battles like this, and yet it still cut deep every time. With a sigh, he tossed the paper into the trash and grabbed his coat. Shot to At Oak Hill Middle School, Principal Sarah Whitaker was reviewing the final plans for the upcoming community fundraiser. The event was her way of keeping momentum alive for the center's reconstruction. Her students were pitching in, organizing performances, selling baked goods, and collecting donations. "Miss Whitaker?" Marcus's voice broke her concentration. Sarah looked up to see him standing in the doorway, his usual bravado dimmed. "What's up, Marcus?" she asked, setting her papers aside. He shuffled his feet. You heard about the graffiti?" Sarah stiffened. "Graffiti? Where?" Marcus hesitated. "It's on the back of the wall. I saw it this morning on my way to school." "It's bad." Sarah's heart sank. "Thank you for telling me, Marcus. I'll take care of it." When Sarah arrived at the site, David was already there, staring at the crude slurs spray-painted on the back of the wall. His face was unreadable, but Sarah could sense the frustration radiating off him. "This isn't just vandalism," she said quietly. "It's a message." "I know," David replied. His voice was steady, but his hands were clenched into fists. "But we've dealt with messages like this before. And we'll deal with this one too." The two worked in silence, scrubbing away the hateful words. As the sun began to set, a few other volunteers arrived, word having spread quickly through the neighborhood. Among them was Maria, her son Luis trailing behind her. "Not again," Maria murmured, shaking her head as she grabbed a brush. "Again and again, if we have to," David said firmly. "They won't win." Later that night, as David locked up the church, a shadowed figure approached him. It was Luis, Maria's teenage son. His hood was pulled up, and he looked around nervously before speaking. "Pastor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think I know who did it." David's chest tightened. "Go on." Luis hesitated, his eyes darting away. "It's some of the older kids from my school. They think the center's a waste of time, that it's just for people who don't deserve it." David's heart sank. "Did you tell anyone else?" Luis shook his head. "I didn't want to get involved, but I thought you should know." David placed a hand on Luis's shoulder. "Thank you for telling me. You did the right thing." The next day, David and Sarah met to discuss the revelation. "We can't ignore this," Sarah said, pacing her office. "If these kids are involved, it's a bigger problem than just the graffiti." David nodded. "Agreed, but if we come down on them too hard, we risk pushing them further away." "Then what do we do?" David paused, his mind working through the possibilities. "We reach out. We find out why they feel this way and show them that this center is for everyone, including them." Sarah sighed. "You're always the optimist. And you're always the realist," David countered with a small smile. "That's why this works." The opportunity to address the issue came sooner than expected. That weekend, during a basketball game at the school gym, A fight broke out between two groups of students, one from the neighborhood's white community, the other from the black community. Sarah and David rushed to the scene, finding the gym in chaos. Teachers were trying to separate the students, but the hostility in the room was palpable. "Enough!" David's voice boomed, silencing the crowd. The students froze, their anger momentarily replaced by surprise. Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "What's going on here? Why are you fighting?" One of the boys, a tall white teenager with a defiant expression, crossed his arms. "They think the new center's just for them, like they're the only ones who matter." "That's not true!" shouted another boy from the other side, his fists still clenched. "You just don't want us to have anything nice." David stepped between them, his gaze steady. "Stop, all of you. This is exactly what the people tearing us apart want, for us to fight each other instead of coming together." The boys muttered under their breath but stayed silent. "You think this center is for someone else?" Sarah asked, addressing the group. "It's not. It's for all of you. To play, to learn, to grow. But it can't happen if we keep tearing each other down." The fight was a turning point. David and Sarah decided to start a youth mentorship program as part of the center's rebuilding efforts, pairing older students with younger ones to foster understanding and collaboration. To everyone's surprise, the teenager who had been most vocal during the fight, Zach, the tall boy with the defiant stance, was the first to volunteer. "I don't want to fight anymore," he admitted to David one evening after a mentorship meeting. I don't know where I fit in." David placed a hand on Zach's shoulder. "You fit in right here, son. And you're helping us build something stronger than anything we've seen before." By the end of the chapter, the community's divisions were far from healed, but the fire of anger and resentment had begun to cool. And in its place, a new fire sparked, one of understanding, collaboration, and the realization that transformation starts from within. The Wall of Hope stood tall, now a symbol not just of resilience, but of the hard conversations and brave steps it took to get there. The rhythmic pounding of hammers echoed across Elm Street as construction of the new community center entered its final phase. The lot, once a desolate ruin, was now bustling with activity. Bright orange safety vests dotted the site as volunteers and construction workers brought David and Sarah's vision to life. The building itself was designed to symbolize unity. Its facade featured materials salvaged from the original center, woven into a modern structure with large windows that let light pour in. Above the entrance, a metal arch read, "The Elm Street Community Center, built together." David arrived early every morning, walking the grounds with the site manager and offering encouragement to the volunteers. Today, he paused by the Wall of Hope, now carefully preserved in the center's courtyard. Messages from residents continued to appear, scrawled in fresh ink, a testament to the growing support for the project. He ran his hand over a new edition, "Stronger Together, Luis and Maria." David smiled, the warmth in his chest momentarily chasing away the exhaustion that had built over weeks of non-stop work. Inside the nearly finished building, Sarah was leading a group of students through a walkthrough. They marveled at the spacious recreation room, the sunlit library filled with shelves donated by the local bookshop, and the new computer lab outfitted with sleek desktops. "This is going to be amazing," Elena whispered to Marcus, who nodded in agreement. Sarah caught their exchange and smiled. "This place is for all of you, and it's up to you to take care of it, to make it what it's meant to be." Marcus raised a hand, a mischievous grin on his face. "Does that mean we can decide on the snacks for the vending machines?" Laughter rippled through the group, and even Sarah chuckled. "We'll talk about it." The final piece of the project was the bridge spanning the creek that divided the neighborhood. For years, the bridge had been more symbolic than practical, a narrow, crumbling path that many avoided. Now, it was being replaced with a sturdy new structure wide enough to accommodate bike paths and pedestrians. The bridge was David's favorite part of the project. He often stood there in the evenings, watching the sun set over Oak Hill, the glow of the construction site behind him. It reminded him of his father's words. Bridges are stronger than walls, son, but they take time and faith to build. One evening, as David stood on the bridge, Sarah joined him, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. She handed one to him and leaned against the railing. "We're almost there," she said, her breath visible in the chilly air. David nodded. "It's hard to believe, but seeing it come together, it feels worth it." Sarah looked out at the water below. "You ever think about what happens after this? When the center's open and all the work is done?" David smiled softly. "The work is never really done, Sarah, but I think the people here will carry it forward. We've planted the seeds. It's their turn to make them grow." She tilted her head, studying him. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I have to," he said. "Faith is all about believing in what you can't yet see." Opening day dawned bright and clear. The entire neighborhood seemed to gather at the center, filling the newly paved lot with laughter and chatter. Children played on the swings while families lined up to tour the building. Food trucks parked along the street, offering everything from tacos to barbecue. The air buzzed with excitement, but beneath it all was a sense of cautious optimism. For many, this was more than just a building. It was a chance to rebuild trust and community. David stood on the small stage set up in front of the center, microphone in hand. Sarah stood beside him, flanked by volunteers, students, and longtime residents. "Today isn't just about opening a building," David began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "It's about opening doors, doors to opportunity, to understanding, to hope. This center was built by all of you, for all of you. It's a reminder that when we come together, there's nothing we can't accomplish." Applause rippled through the crowd. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes scanning the faces before her. "This isn't the end of our journey, it's the beginning. The center belongs to every single person here, and it's up to us to make it a place where everyone feels welcome." The applause swelled, and tears pricked Sarah's eyes. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the crowd surged into the center. Children raced to the basketball court, their laughter echoing through the halls. In the library, a group of students flipped through books, while their parents chatted in the adjacent lounge. David wandered through the building, soaking in the sights and sounds. He found Maria and Luis standing near the computer lab. "Looks like someone's ready to try out those computers," David said, nodding toward Luis, who was already exploring the keyboard. Maria smiled. "This place is going to change his life. Thank you, Pastor." "It wasn't just me," David said. "It was all of us." As the day wound down, Sarah found herself back on the bridge. This time, she wasn't alone. Marcus and Elena were there, sitting on the railing and watching the creek below. "You two should head home soon," Sarah said with a smile. Marcus grinned. "We were just talking about how cool the center is. You guys did good, Ms. Whitaker." "Thanks, Marcus," Sarah replied, her heart swelling. As she walked back toward the center, she spotted David standing near the wall of hope, talking to a group of elders from his church. She caught his eye and gave him a small wave. He nodded, his expression one of quiet pride. That night, as the center's lights dimmed and the last visitors left, David and Sarah stood together in the quiet courtyard. "We did it," Sarah said softly. David smiled, his voice full of warmth. "No, they did it. We just showed them the way." The wall of hope loomed behind them, now a permanent fixture of the courtyard. It was a patchwork of voices, a symbol of what Oak Hill had endured and what it had become. And as they looked out at the bridge stretching across the creek, lit softly by the glow of streetlights, they knew that Oak Hill's story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Winter faded into spring, and with it came a fresh energy that seemed to pulse through Oak Hill. The newly rebuilt Elm Street Community Center had been open for a few months, and already it was becoming the heartbeat of the neighborhood once more. The sound of children's laughter spilled out from the gymnasium. The hum of conversation echoed from the meeting rooms where parents, teachers, and volunteers gathered to plan programs. The garden behind the center, planted with the help of local families, was bursting with the first hints of green. The center had become more than a building. It was a home, a promise kept, and a bridge to something better. David Grant walked through the halls one morning, stopping to greet people along the way. In the library, a group of elementary school kids sat in a circle, listening intently as a volunteer read aloud from a picture book. Down the hall, Maria led a cooking class for teenagers, teaching them how to make traditional dishes from her childhood. David smiled as he passed the gym, where Zach, the teenager who had once been on the verge of losing himself to anger, was now leading a youth basketball practice. The sound of sneakers squeaking against the polished floor and the occasional cheers of encouragement filled the space. "Nice shot," Zach called out as a boy sank a basket. David caught his eye and gave him a thumbs up. Zach grinned and waved, his confidence growing with every passing day. In the computer lab, Sarah Whitaker sat with Elena and Marcus, reviewing a digital presentation the students had created for their school's history fair. "This is incredible work," Sarah said, her tone full of pride. "You've highlighted everything, how the center started, the challenges we faced, and how we rebuilt it together." Elena smiled shyly. "We just wanted people to see what it means to the neighborhood." Marcus leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Yeah, and we made sure to mention the vending machines." Sarah laughed, shaking her head. "You're not going to let that go, are you?" "Nope," Marcus replied, flashing a cheeky grin. That evening, the center hosted its first interfaith dialogue session. People of all backgrounds and beliefs filled the meeting room, sharing stories, questions, and ideas. David sat beside Sarah as a young woman stood to speak. "My parents moved here 20 years ago," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "They always said this community was divided, but now I see something different. I see people who care about each other, who are willing to work together. This center made that possible." Applause followed, and Sarah turned to David, her eyes shimmering with tears. "This is what we hoped for," she whispered. David nodded. "This is what we prayed for." The wall of hope, now protected under a clear canopy in the center's courtyard, continued to grow. New messages appeared almost daily. "Thank you for believing in us." "To the future of Oak Hill." "For my mom, who never stopped fighting for this neighborhood." One afternoon, David found a note that made him pause. It was written in a familiar scrawl. "I'm sorry. I want to do better. A friend." He stared at it for a long time, his thoughts drifting to the vandals who had tried to tear the community apart. Perhaps this was from one of them, or perhaps it was from someone else entirely. Either way, it was a reminder of what the center stood for: forgiveness, growth, and second chances. As summer approached, the center hosted its first annual Oak Hill Unity Festival. The event brought together families from every corner of the neighborhood. Food stalls lined the sidewalks, offering dishes from various cultures. Musicians played on a makeshift stage, their melodies weaving a tapestry of joy and celebration. David and Sarah walked through the festival together, marveling at the sight. "Look at them," Sarah said, gesturing to a group of kids from different backgrounds playing tag near the garden. "They don't even see the divisions that used to hold us back." David smiled, his heart full. "That's because they're growing up in a different Oak Hill, one we built together." As the sun set, the festival reached its climax. Families gathered at the bridge on Elm Street, now a gleaming, sturdy structure illuminated by soft lights. David stood at the center of the bridge, addressing the crowd. "Tonight, we celebrate more than just a building," he said, his voice strong but filled with emotion. "We celebrate each other. We've shown that when we come together, we can overcome anything. This bridge is more than a way to cross a creek. It's a symbol of what we can accomplish when we choose connection over division, hope over despair." The crowd erupted in applause, and as David stepped aside, Sarah joined him. "You know," she said, smiling, "this isn't just a bridge for them. It's a bridge for us, too." David looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "We've crossed a lot of bridges, haven't we?" "And burned a few," Sarah joked, earning a laugh from David. They stood there together, watching as the people of Oak Hill crossed the bridge, their faces alight with joy. In the weeks that followed, the center continued to thrive. Programs expanded, partnerships flourished, and the people of Oak Hill grew closer. David, sitting in his office one evening, looked out the window at the lights of the center glowing against the dark sky. He thought of his father, of his words about bridges and walls. "You were right, Dad," he murmured. "They're stronger than walls. Every time." Meanwhile, Sarah sat at her desk in the school, reviewing a proposal for a student-led community project. The journey had been long and hard, but she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. In their hearts, both David and Sarah knew this was more than a chapter in Oak Hill's story. It was the start of a new book, one filled with resilience, unity, and boundless hope. And together, they'd helped write it.